Um, Thanks for joining us. Well, I say this evening, it's 8:34 here in Adelaide, South Australia. I know that there's obviously people here from the UK, Japan, and various other countries that I know people are from. Um, Thank you, Romana, for inviting me to be part of this series, um, which I know the focus has been on teaching and learning, broadly conceived. But obviously, or not but, but today we're going to be talking about PhD supervision or creative PhD, screenwriting PhDs, again, broadly. And I'm really going to be thinking about and talking about and encouraging you to reflect on, and obviously we have discussion time as well. And please use the chat. I'm keeping an eye on the chat so I can kind of see what you're saying. Thinking about uh, the role of supervisors, the role of people who are supervising PhDs. Um, I've got two kind of slide decks, if you like, to present from today. This first one is going to be just, I guess, reinforcing some of the key aspects of creative practice research and how that links to screenwriting. And I'm going to be trying to think through these concepts through the lens of supervision. And also then the second slide, which is a little bit more detailed around the screenwriting PhD quite specifically. I'll not be covering all of that second slide. I'll be skipping slides because some of that work I'll be presenting in the Czech Republic later in the year for those who are going to be there in September. So I guess, yeah, just reinforcing the idea that PhD super, well, first of all, maybe I'll just get a show of hands, literal or virtual. Who in the room is a PhD student? Just looking, just perhaps do some signal. Okay, yeah, great. Hi, CZ. Who in the room is doing or is going to be doing or is interested in being the PhD supervisor? Okay, great. Who's in the wrong room? Who thought it was going to be, I don't know, conspiracy theory meet-up? No, just two of you. That's great. I'll try and work that in as well. So I guess one thing I wanted to say before I start, not that I haven't started yet, but is that as many of you know, who for those who have completed PhDs and also current people who are doing PhDs, we've got to remember when we're supervising that unless you're an absolute genius, and there are some out there, but not always in our area. PhD students or candidates, as we sometimes call them, don't come into the PhD program or the doctoral program, because sometimes it's not a PhD, it's a doctor of something. Do not come into the program able to do that work just like that. People generally don't come into a PhD program thinking and working at the doctoral level. And it sounds really obvious because obviously the whole point of doing a PhD or a doctorate is not just to do, a massive work, but actually to kind of be trained. And we call it over here in Australia research training, to be trained to work and think like a doctoral scholar. And there's loads of theories around what doctoral level learning means. It's around post-formal learning and metacognitive kind of abilities or capabilities. But I guess the point I'm making is that for supervisors, we sometimes, or some supervisors sometimes don't fully acknowledge or don't quite maybe remember that these candidates or students undertaking doctorates actually need to be taught or trained to actually think critically at a very high level. So yes, it's all good and well just giving feedback and notes here and there, whether it's on the creative work or the critical work. But actually, a lot of the supervision, good supervision, is really about enabling your candidates, your PhD students, to be able to really think for themselves. And as I'll probably come to a little bit later, really think about I guess, the whole system in which someone is working, thinking about all the contexts in which you're working, in this case, creative work, critical work, industry context, professional contexts, and almost as well second guess what things, if you changed one piece of the puzzle of your thesis, for example, how everything else would need to change, and how knowledge is contextual, and ideas don't just exist, but they exist in relation to other ideas and other knowledge systems. And that's actually quite, it sounds a bit scary potentially, but it's actually quite, quite hard to grapple with that as a candidate. And this is why if you've done your PhD already, or if you're in the middle of it, in fact, you might sometimes feel, I guess, overwhelmed or worried that you can't do it, or you just want to give up. And that's really, really common. We've all done that. I was about to give up when I was doing mine, numerous times actually. I think at one point someone told me to give up, but that's another story. And that's all because you can't quite grapple with what it means to be able to think at a really high intellectual level, at a kind of post-formal metacognitive level. Hence, supervision is really important because it's about guiding that process. And also when someone is perhaps struggling, and of course, a lot of PhD candidates do struggle. It's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's in some ways it's to be embraced, because it's like a hurdle you have to overcome to become better. That supervisors also need to manage that process as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to give a context around why supervision is a really, really important aspect of candidates doing PhDs, and really good supervision. And I think I would argue, not everyone would agree, but I would argue that supervisors also need to take an active role in thinking about what supervision is, and doing maybe kind of conferences or reading about supervision to understand what is going on with candidates as they are progressing through. So let me just whiz through a few slides around creative practice research, just to give that broad overview of what kind of area, what kind of domain, or what kind of knowledge system, and what kind of methodology we're talking about in this seminar today. Obviously, then I'll be relating it quite specifically to screenwriting. And obviously, various people here are from different countries, and different countries have different traditions and different histories of creative PhDs. So for some of you, this will be really obvious and you've heard all about it. For some of you, it still might be quite new. I've in fact, just finished co-supervising a PhD student in Estonia, and it was that university's only ever second creative PhD. So you can see that, there's in some areas there's still a lot to be learned. So creative practice research, I call it creative practice research. It is also known as practice-based research, practice-led research, etc., etc. I like to call it creative practice research because I see it as a whole kind of domain under which different branches of creative practice research exist, and I'll come on to that later. It is, nowadays, 2024, it is a staple of the research landscape of many countries, as I've said, in particular, Australia, the UK, Ireland, New Zealand, some Northern European countries as well. But in other countries, other nations, it is still emerging. It's when we talk about, what is I guess the examinable artifact, what is the creative work of a PhD and of a screenwriting PhD? We're talking about obviously screenplays, portfolios of scripts, script development documents, etc., etc. And for those who work in universities, you may be aware of this already, but creative artifacts, creative research works. In some countries, a real, again, a staple, a really strong feature of how universities are assessed in their research. Yes, it's publications like journal articles, books, but obviously in some countries, in some fields, screen, creative writing, design, etc., etc., that, a lot of the submissions that are put in for research evaluation are creative works. So it's not new, but it's still, nascent compared to other knowledge areas, domains, disciplines. And obviously, many of you know this because many of you are this person, but research training, or a PhD, is a really appealing avenue for creative practitioners who want to teach in universities. Some of you, including myself back in the day, are working in universities, and in many ways are doing a PhD because it's kind of a expectation to either get a job, full-time ongoing job, or to be made ongoing, continuing. In some cases, I've supervised candidates who have had jobs, but they were given a bit of an ultimatum. You need to finish a PhD in so many years, otherwise you might not get your probation. So it is a very practical thing as well. But obviously today we're going to talk ideally about the potential of what it is beyond just a practical thing. But of course, many practitioners are now coming into the university to do PhDs, and some of you are in the room, and I know many people who have really strong industry careers as writers and script editors and producers and other things, who are now doing or who have got PhDs. Um, Australia has the most creative practice PhD completions than any other country in the world. You're talking several thousands, followed by the UK. And this is, I guess, is partly a historical thing, but also it's worth noting that in Australia, as it is the case in, I think, Germany and Austria and maybe a couple of other countries, for PhD students who are domestic students, there is no fee. So PhDs are actually free in Australia, which is why there's a lot of people who are doing them. And again, just to reiterate that what kind of areas that people work in: creative practice, research. We're talking about art, design, music, film, performing arts, creative and professional writing, digital media, etc. But that real focus clearly on practice. And there are different ways, as I'll discuss in a bit, there are different ways of understanding what the practice is in a creative PhD. It's not just one thing. It has different branches and different purposes, which hopefully I'll explain in more detail in a bit. What is creative practice research? Well, sometimes, especially when people are applying to do a doctorate, people often ask, well, what is it? What is what does a creative work look like when it's a research work? What is the difference between a screenplay and a PhD screenplay? And again, this is not a simple answer. There's kind of actually a couple of answers, to be honest. But broadly speaking, I will say, it's different to what it would have looked, sounded, or felt like before it came into a research setting. So it has to be different in some way. There is a caveat to that, which I'll come to later. But think about research as enabling new forms of practice, whether it's new processes, new ways of working, whether the content or the representations that, for example, you're offering in your screenplay in this case are offering some new knowledge, whether it's the aesthetic values, whether it's the craft, etc., etc. It has to be doing something different. And again, I probably haven't got time to talk too much about this today, but we talk about this, new knowledge. What is new knowledge? And it can't be just trivial knowledge. It has to be a contribution to knowledge, more broadly speaking. When I will come back to this a bit later. I'm going to be just peppering throughout the talk today just images of some examples of what creative practice research outputs look like. And obviously, they're not all screenplays. Some of them are. This is obviously contemporary visual art as well as public art, sculpture as well as screenwriting. The one on the bottom right there is a screenplay, PhD screenplay that I supervised a few years ago, and the ones on the left, it's obviously contemporary art, visual arts, public art, sculpture. But I guess that what I'm trying to say is that creative artifacts, creative knowledge, objects, it can pretty much be anything. It has to be contributing something new, clearly, but it could just be, it should be something that you never really imagined would be the thing when you come into the research degree of the PhD. So you'll see a lot of images of what these things are, and what new knowledge, what creative knowledge can look like. And this is another key question, which I think is really important for supervisors. And I've heard many supervisors give different answers to this and be quite strident around what they think. Does the creative work come before the critical writing? Do you make the work first, and then do you write the exegesis or the thesis or the dissertation later? Or do you do all the underpinning research and critical thinking, writing first, and then do you make the creative work? And again, there are different ways of looking at this depending on the kind of creative research approach you're taking, which I'll explain in a little while. But broadly speaking, it's together, it's both. We talk about praxis, creative practice, but creative praxis, you'll kind of think, is that the idea of theory and practice coming together and therefore creating some new kind of critical practice, which because it's been informed by or embedded by theory of whatever type. we talk about it as praxis. So simultaneous. Again, I've been supervising candidates before where one of the other supervisors has said, no, 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 put down the journal articles, put down the books, just write the script, devise the characters. You can write it all up later. But then the question is, well, what are you writing in that script? What's your research question? How is your writing related to the research question? If your research question is about some concept, theory, idea, how can you write creatively without researching that idea first? But at the same time, you might have I'll come to this later, but you might have a process-based research question, which does mean that you would normally write and iterate and reflect on the drafting process, which is a different kind of model. So, but even so, even if you're doing that, you're still reflecting, and if you're writing journaling or reflective diaries and all of that stuff you're doing, that is still research. It's still theory in inverted commas, because you're theorizing what you've been doing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's together. I would be very nervous of someone who said, just write all the stuff, do your creative work, and at the end, just write up some exegesis about something that's connected. I think that's a real danger. So it's all about putting the creative practice and, of course, the creative practitioner into a space of research incubation, creating new knowledge for theory and for practice. And don't underestimate the role that the practitioner, the creative, has in this kind of work. Usually, I mean, there are examples of this, but usually you're not a sociologist who's coming in to do something sociological, and you just happen to be using screenwriting as a way of presenting your work. I mean, that is kind of possible. But if it's a screenwriting or a creative practice PhD, you're more often than not a practitioner, either established or emerging, and you are your lens, your worldview, your experience, all that has a strong bearing on the kind of work that you do. The knowledge that you bring about the practice, the way that you even theorize and look at theory and understand theory is different, because you're thinking about it in a practical way. So don't underestimate that. And again, through the lens of supervision, it's thinking about harnessing people to think of themselves as, practitioner researchers who are doing research, and it has to be rigorous and all those things, but they're bringing a particular practitioner lens to it, which, is really, really important. There's nothing worse in a way than reading, examining, etc. Something that is it's been almost like written by someone that the person is not. It's almost like denying their kind of creative professional voice. And again, as ever, we'll come back to that a bit later. These are just a few little quotations. Some of them are quite old now. One of them is an article I co-published with a colleague of mine, Marcia Berry, just around what it means to do a creative research degree, a creative PhD. Cherry and Higgs talk about the possibility for surprise, the kind of creative disruption that precedes innovation, i.e. for practitioners, usually, not always, but usually, you bring in your creative work, your professional practice into a new space that can be freeing, and it can allow you to do things differently. It's kind of creative disruption or experimental development, and you kind of like unshackling yourself from all the things you've done previously for industry potentially, and it kind of frees it up and injects some new ideas and some new ways of working. And in the second one there, it's just about this idea of, you're improving or innovating practice, and by doing so, you're also creating knowledge about the practice, again, drawn from the insider's perspective. This is a specific quotation about how research is defined in Australia. Obviously, this is where I'm based, so that's where I've got this from. But obviously, if you're not from Australia, which is fine, you don't have to be, I would, you look at your own countries. Usually, the country has, like, the Research Council, the government have a kind of a definition of what research is in your country. This, for example, the Australian one is the creation of new knowledge and or the use of existing knowledge in new and creative ways. So it's to generate new concepts, methodologies, and understandings, consistent with broad notion of research and experimental development, comprises creative work undertaken on a systematic basis in order to increase the stock of knowledge. And the use of this stock of knowledge can be also to devise new applications. So in our research system, in others as well, there's a really clear nod to or articulation of creative work, creative practice, applied creativity as being new knowledge. There's no doubt that governments, etc., accept that this is what knowledge can be. But it's kind of surprising that, sometimes people find it really hard to articulate and define creative work as knowledge or as research. But it's all there in kind of in policy. The bottom right picture there, that's just an example of, that's a really fabulous group called the Ironing Maidens. And the person on the left there, Patty, she did quite recently, it was a master's by research. It wasn't PhD, but she's doing a PhD now. And basically this is their creative practice and this is their research. So what this couple do is, and this is what her research is about, Patty on the left there. It's all about cybersonic feminism, domesticity, gender, and basically they make musical instruments out of household devices. So you see the irons there, they're actually musical instruments. So they're kind of using them. So they're using their creative practice that's informed by theory, what's it called? Cybersonic feminist theory, and other things to really, and that's what underpins their creative practice. So even though it looks like it might just be a fun musical gig, there's actually a lot of conceptual work behind that, which again is helping to define why, helping candidates to really understand how and why their practice is research. It doesn't have to be technological like this or technology and theory. It could be something else. Some people could be interested in, I don't know, policy or something, and that might underpin their practice. I'll just mention this. I don't want to dwell on it too much because it's a whole conversation, but we talk about art. Well, you can talk about art versus research. In some countries, particularly in Northern Europe, they often talk about creative practice research as artistic research. And so there's a really deliberate attempt to talk about, the artistic practice. There is this article, which is a little bit old now, Tara Brabazon and Dagley, who was her PhD student at the time, writing about filmmaking as research. And they talk about, it's quite a provocative article, I have to say. It's provocative. They talk about how when you're doing a PhD, you're not making art, you're doing research. And so the creative work is an artifact, it's a research artifact. It is not art. You can't call it art, it's not art, it's research. Now that's really polarizing in many ways. I think some of what they're saying is you can see why they're trying to distinguish, the whole thing around underpinning research, systematic, all that kind of thing. As if art doesn't do that, but obviously people might argue that it does do that. So just letting you know that there are some debates around that. And again, you might ask, well, and it depends on your notion of what art is, I guess, but, is art, when you go to a gallery, if you go to a gallery, do you read the explanation, the little artist statement on the wall? Or do you just not even look at it because you just want to interpret it and it's your kind of, your interpretation? If you think about that in the context of examination, if an examiner was to be presented with a screenplay to examine as a PhD or any other creative work for that matter, and there was no abstract, no introduction, nothing, you just was given it and said, here's a script, examine it as a research output. You might, where would you start? Now, some of you might go, oh, I can tell, yeah, I'm reading through this and I can tell what it's about. I'm pretty sure it's about this and blah, blah, blah. But it might not be, which is why the abstract is obviously really crucial right at the beginning, and then the whole exegesis is explaining and theorizing the creative work as research. So you can see the parallel there between you know, research that might look artistic, but actually has particular framing versus art, which is just here it is, do what you want with it. It doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong. It's up to you. You interpret it as you wish. Can you say that about research? Because the definitions of research don't really match that. But of course, if you have a different philosophical position, you could make an argument about that. And people do. I guess what I'm saying is that it's a very complex space, and there's no kind of strict rule book. As long as it's all about being able to articulate what you're doing and why, and which branch of ontology or epistemology you come from can determine how you talk about things. And obviously, so with your candidates, again, just get them to think about, well, how do they talk about their work as research? What does knowledge mean to them? And again, just some examples there of recent-ish doctoral creative works. The one on the right there is a screenwriting PhD, obviously. Looks very standard in many ways it is, but the little red boxes you can see, little hyperlinks, this was a way of connecting Story Bible to the script. So when you're reading the pilot, you click through and you get to read the Bible kind of in sync, back and forth, rather than separate documents, etc. And the whole premise of that PhD was looking at different layering and techniques for developing long-form television series, looking at seriality and character arcs. So, and that obviously without reading it, you can't really tell, but that's how one of the findings was around embedding serial element kind of descriptors and particular positions within the script, so you know what those things are doing and you know what point of that scene is, for example. Definitions and debates. I've just mentioned this before. Some of you maybe doing or have done, or you look at your own PhD thesis, if you finish, you might be using practice-led research. You might use research-led practice. You might say, no, it's practice-based research. You might say, no, I'm doing research through practice. And someone might go, no, practice as research. The practice is the research. And this can be really confusing because in one way, it's all the same thing. It's all the same kind of field, I guess, which is why I call it creative practice research. But it does have different branches. And I'll talk in a minute about two that I think are quite distinctive. And of course, as you can see in these examples, and this is why maybe it's just me and the kind of interest I have in this area, but I do think it's really important for supervisors to be across the literature in creative research and particularly here screenwriting research, because yeah, you might, I don't know, a candidate might write, I'm doing practice-led research. You might go, yeah, sounds good, I've heard of that before, fine. But actually the way that the thesis plays out, it might not be, it might be research-led practice. There's actually quite subtle but important differences in how these definitions work. And so I think for supervision, I'm not saying you have to, read articles every night, of course, but, I think it's really important you do read around the methodology, because as I'll explain later, I've examined quite a lot of PhDs over the years, and God, how many? The biggest thing that comes up in, I would say 90% of the cases is that understanding of what is the creative work doing, what is its role, and how does it link to the research question and the research design? Is the creative work embodying, performing all the findings, and it's there, ta-da, everything about the underpinning research is there? Or is it that the creative work is more a method that you go through different drafts and cyclical, and you kind of build on it and reflect on it, and so the purpose is quite different, and the new knowledge is quite different. So I think it is important, I think, to be aware of these slight differences. And again, I'll show you something in a minute that probably hopefully explains it a little bit better. So thinking about research question, research design, outcome. You might think, and again, I'm just guessing, so I'm probably wrong, but if you start using language or hear language around research, you might think research question, okay, that's fine, I understand what that is. Research design, people go, oh gosh, what does that mean? It sounds a bit scientific. Methodology. Oh no, gosh, that sounds too. No, we're creative. We don't do methodology. Contribution, significance, impact. Oh no, that's too. No, that's what engineers do. We don't. But actually, it is important because everybody does this. Every thesis, whether it's creative or chemical engineering, has a contribution. It has a significance. Obviously, impact might be future impact, but you need to think about what that would be. And everything has a research design. The research design might be, or the methodology might be an off-the-shelf. I'm using, blah and blah's framework for, qualitative interviews, bang, and it's just really off the shelf. It is what it is, fine. But even if you're doing something that's really messy and creative and all over the place and experimental and iterative and drafting and all of that, well, that is the research design. And you still have to put some framing around it and say, for example, I'm working in the domain of creative practice research, which is defined as this. These are the steps I'm going to go through, whether it's iterations, drafts, reflections, experiments, whatever it is. And you have to kind of explain how together that equates to a purposeful research design, even if the whole point is just to kind of see what happens. The fact that you're even doing this as a research degree and going into it knowing that you're going to see what happens and then somehow evaluate it and write about it, that is a methodology. So try not to avoid, and with your candidates, just go, oh, well, it's different. We don't do methodology, because actually you do. The image there at the bottom, that is from a filmmaking, so not screenwriting in particular, but filmmaking PhD that I co-supervised a few years ago, where she conceived of this quite early on in the piece, probably in the application, but certainly by the time she did her confirmation of candidature. It was like a series of experiments where she made films, but also remade films from previous films she'd made. For example, picking out cutaways and edits that weren't used and all those things, remaking things. And it was all around reflecting on her practice as a filmmaker. And it was about a particular kind of documentary subject, documentary filmmaker relationship kind of research question. So it was, it's quite targeted, but she made all these things and eventually she pulled it together in what she called, I think, a honeycomb structure. So you'll see there, that was essentially the thesis. So if you look from left to right, obviously down and up and down, every chapter, well, the text there is the chapters, the introduction, methodology, etc. Then every experimental film every film which she framed as an experiment was accompanied by a kind of an essay / chapter that was kind of reflective, that brought a theory to help her understand the film that she made. And it kind of built through. So when you work your way through, she kind of came to this big conclusion about it's around the filmmaker and the documentary subject. Hence the final was called The Meeting Place. She kind of theorized what this space is between the two and how it works, and used things like non-representational theory, etc. But she wove it all through, and then she presented the thesis, I guess, a bit like a journey through this thinking, this reflective practitioner. So it definitely had a methodology, but look how it looks. That's literally how the thesis was laid out. It was really good, by the way. Some of you may have seen this diagram before. I've shown it a few times in various places. It's a terrible diagram in design sense, but it's Smith and Dean, 2009, practice-led research, research-led practice, in which they do differentiate between the two ways of working. But this diagram is basically showing that it's all connected, messy, iterative, cyclical. That's what creative research looks like. So you can see why, compared to something else, like if it was, I don't know, media studies or, I don't know, science or whatever. Not that science is really broad, isn't it? But chemical engineering. You can see that it does look quite, oh my gosh, what even is this? But even in this kind of madness, if you like, there is a method, quite literally. So, can be overwhelming. And again, thinking about supervision, helping your candidates to really understand what is the role of the creative work, even what do they define as research? Like, if you say research, do you mean research as in you're doing research, or are you talk like as in the verb, or are you talking about a piece of research? It's like a research output. Two different things. You can just say research. Again, if you're not really sure, if you're not defining it, sometimes it can be quite confusing. Oops. Obviously, I didn't do the transitions very well there, or the dissolve, so apologies. But from all those definitions, I've come up with these refined definitions that I will be hopefully publishing on soon. I've been saying that for 8 years, but this is the year. The first one is I'm calling research-enabled practice, and the second I'm calling practice-enabled knowledge. And basically, the long and the short of it is that the research-enabled practice is where underpinning research and research methods, which might be more traditional, could be case studies. A lot of people do case studies in screenwriting PhDs. It could be interviews with practitioners. It could be ethnographic work, for example, running writers' rooms. I had a PhD just finished. He did that as his PhD, working with a particular demographic. All of that kind of underpins, and the findings that you get from doing that research work determine what the practice, what the piece, the creative work needs to be like, what it looks like, depending on the research question, what the content is and how it's executed. And often this is where you spend a lot of time initially, reading, theorizing, getting to grips with the literature. Yes, creative PhDs do often have literature reviews. They're not always, but they do. And some people say, oh, you don't do literature reviews, but actually you can. Then once you know exactly what you're doing and what, where the gaps are in the field, then you kind of can respond through a creative work. The other branch, which I'm calling practice-enabled knowledge, as opposed to in all the other models, research-enabled practice would be flipped to practice-enabled research. But I'm flipping it to practice-enabled knowledge because the outcome is the practice enables knowledge. It creates knowledge because it's used as a method. So in this case, it's basically the idea that you would undertake various drafts of screenplay. In this case, you go through particular cycles. You might have a particular framework or a through line, if you want to use a pun there, that would have a particular kind of connected research question. But the whole point of the iterative cyclical process, like action research, actually is what it is that you, through the process, you reflect on what you've done, and the kind of the new knowledge is about the process. Now, I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive and that, they don't cross over because they do, but just to hopefully exemplify this, if you look on the screen there, got two potential research questions. The first one there, how might a screenplay represent the experience of family homelessness? And I have seen a film which, was about this, which is why it inspired me to just use this one as an example. If you were supervising, if someone's applying for a PhD, if you're examining a PhD, where the research question is, how might a screenplay represent the experience of family homelessness? Quite clearly, you're going to be looking at the screenplay as the final creative work, and you're going to be looking at what techniques have been used to represent family homelessness. What is there a new way of doing this, or an interesting way of doing this? Quite clearly, you can't just write a screenplay about family homelessness and then just decide that it's new knowledge and, hey, isn't it great? Give me a PhD. You would have to read screenplays and or watch films or TV series that do the same thing, and you have to analyze them and see how they've done it, and your work would then have to kind of take that knowledge further and do it differently. You might be reading theories around, you know, I guess cost of living crisis and families being, driven literally to live in cars and things. You'd actually be reading that kind of literature to understand the field of family homelessness. And then your work would embody that and respond to that. So the screenplay is a real, it's got knowledge in it because all the research you've done first about the topic has really informed what that work is. Yes, you would have gone through various drafts, you'd have probably reflected and thought about it, but that's not your research question. It could be, but it's not. In the other version, again, slightly different, the research question might be, how can a screenwriter navigate the script development process using theme as a collaborative tool? Yes, there might be a final script, and it might be, about a particular, well, it would be about a particular topic or theme or et cetera, et cetera. But really, this is about screenwriting process and how, script development can be understood by using a particular, in this case, theme as a collaborative tool. It's like an experiment using a new or whatever way of doing something. And so the contribution to knowledge in the bottom one is about process, and it's talking about how can a screenwriter navigate this, which is quite different to how does a screenplay represent this. So can you see or hear the differences there? And again, I'm not saying that mutually exclusive and, that you don't learn that process from the top one and the bottom one, doesn't produce a screenplay that, might have new knowledge. But pretty much in a PhD, you can't do everything. It has to be really clear and defined. So this is why I'm trying to kind of pull all these different terminologies together and kind of give two branches of creative practice research, both legitimate, both highly valuable for whichever areas, fields, people, professions, but they're actually quite distinctive ways of working. Sometimes that, I think, is the hardest thing to really conceptualize for candidates. And so I would argue that at the application stage, really work with your applicants, your potential candidates, students, to really understand, do they know why they're writing something, or how is it going to be, what is it going to do, where is the new knowledge? So the role of supervisors, just moving on to this before I show some other stuff, to be playful and responsive, but also to ensure academic standards and creative quality. There's been a few debates over the years around, does it matter if the creative work in a creative PhD is rubbish, as long as the reflection is really good and you've theorized it? Arguably, yeah, it might be rubbish because it might not be the point. Especially it's about the process, it might not really matter if the script, it might be derivative, rubbish, boring, whatever. But I think we probably do a disservice to our disciplines if we kind of not allowed it, but if we didn't really actually ensure there was some creative quality as well, which is why, but equally, there has to be academic standards. And this is why it's really, and I know it's different in different countries, there's different ways of kind of putting together research teams, supervisory teams, but this is why I think it's really important that candidates are supervised by teams, two or three people, because not everyone can know and be brilliant at everything. I mean, it'd be great if we were, wouldn't it? But you just can't, like, how many people would really know exactly all the academic rigor, all the standards, all the methodological whatever, and also be a brilliant script writer and script developer, and do this and be able to supervise, and when things go wrong, be a pastoral kind of player. It's really hard for supervisors to do that, and it's exhausting. It would be exhausting if a person. So I think this is why it's in some universities around the world, particularly in this Australia, it's mandatory to have at least two. In others, it might not be, I'm not sure, but I think it's really important that if you are working with or trying to supervise or starting to supervise, that you actually build a team and that you really let your candidate know that you've got complementary skills, and if you disagree about things, it's not because one is right and one is wrong. It's just different ways of thinking and working. You'll have blind spots. We've all got blind spots. You miss things. You go, oh my God, I never even realized that. How embarrassing. But we just do. And that's the role of having teams. And obviously for the candidate, then they have to kind of negotiate and understand different types of feedback and try and pull it together themselves, which again is why it can be quite complex and overwhelming for a candidate. But that's where this higher order, high level, critical, intellectual thinking comes, being able to piece together, see what's going on and find a way through. So yeah, be playful, be responsive. Just because it's a PhD doesn't mean it has to be boring. You're going to have fun as well. Well, I do. I don't know if nobody else does, but but at the same time, you've got to be ensuring that it does meet the criteria. And every university will have criteria for PhDs. Substantial original contribution to knowledge, professional, blah blah blah, methodological, this, ethical awareness. All of that's all there in your policies. Have a look at it. And if you're really not sure about it and you can't do it, get someone on the team who can. There's no shame in that. I'm in my area. I'm always the grammar Nazi. I know you're not supposed to say that, but I'm always the one who goes through in every comma and every. It's not quite the right verb. That's just the way I am. Supervisors, we're custodians of academic standards. An important part of our role is to guard these. And actually, it is important not just for the academy and for the supervisors, but it's also really important for the candidate as well, because they're going to put their work out there, whether it's examination, peer review, whatever it is. It's in everybody's interest to and sometimes it can be hard to have conversations and say to people, not ready yet, sorry, not ready, oh no, not ready, I know you're trying hard, but no. It's really hard to have those conversations. I remember the first ever PhD completion I had. Student had various supervisors, people had left, moved on, she'd had kids, blah blah blah. She came back and I was new, and so I took her on, whatever. And she worked really, really, really hard. She kind of rewrote the whole thing within a year. And I remember one day she came to my office and she was like, yeah, I think I've cracked it. This is it. And she gave me the draft. In the days it was printed out and I had pen. I didn't do it all online. And I said, oh, look, it's getting there, but it's still not quite there. And I could tell she was a bit like, oh, okay. And she told me afterwards that it really crushed her and she cried on the train home. But I'll tell you what, the next piece of work she put in, oh my God, she got it. It was just that extra little push, and then she passed no revisions. It was just brilliant because she just, she worked really hard, of course, but if I'd have gone, oh yeah, it's not great, let's put it in. Should have had to review, it's just that kind of, so it can be hard being a supervisor because you have to make calls sometimes, and there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake emotionally in a PhD. As soon as somebody knows you're doing a PhD, all of a sudden there's all these expectations on you, and people ask about it all the time, and so it's hard, but obviously in the end it's worth it. At the same time, our role is to guide students to venture into uncharted research spaces where they can push boundaries of both their own creativity and practice and those of the creative arts disciplines. Easier said than done, but practice-based research, this is Harrison and Emerson, who were writing a lot about music PhDs, requires supervisors with extensive skills in both academic and practical domains and some knowledge of acceptable alternative formats in the final presentation. Probably not going into this too much today, but this is another thing as well. Often, and it's becoming more common, I think, now, is that people are starting to do quite experimental theses, things that look very different. Most screenwriting PhDs up until, I don't know, 5 years ago were, here's a feature film script and here's a exegesis dissertation, 40,000 words or whatever. Hardly any in TV. Nowadays, that's becoming more common. But now you've got a lot more experimental, hybrid, fictocritical, interwoven. And that's a whole other skill because you then got to, as a supervisor, not just creative work and the critical writing, but understand how it all fits together. If it is, if it looks different, if it's got embedded videos or it's whatever. That's another thing you've got to grapple with. And you've got to go, oh God, how is that going to look to an examiner? Da, da, da. Sometimes I've done this a few times. You have to say, look, I know you want to do this, blah, 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 but I actually think it's going to be a bit stretched too far. Let's just keep it quite traditional, just to get you through. Missed opportunity potentially, but at the end of the day, you don't want to, spin someone out so they just can't do it in the end. So the more creative, embedded, rated, intertwined, fictocritical, autoethnographic, all of those ones, they're really brilliant theses, but they're really hard to do. So you've got to be really up for not just having the candidate who can do it, but also be up for supervising that kind of thing as well. This is a quote from Jerry Kroll, who she's in the creative writing area. She's very, very, very experienced. Probably supervised about 50 PhDs and examined about 100. She said in this article, obviously it's quite old now. She said, like an Earth mother, this is the supervisor. She nurtures her children, managing to give each one enough attention. She specializes in pastoral care. Like Doctor Who, actually that's spelled wrong. She troubleshoots, negotiating with all forms of academic life. In fact, she can transform at will into whatever she needs to be: an academic, an artist, a mentor, a disciplinarian, a cheerleader. And of course, as a creative scholar who embodies all of these bodies from diverse traditions, she obviously understands cross-disciplinarity. Now that again is like that's almost impossible to find someone like that, but that's what the creative PhD can require. Hence teams and peer-to-peer support groups, people who can give feedback informally as well as formally. Because it's not like a lab where you remember in science disciplines or some science disciplines, PhDs are recruited to work in a lab. Often it's a named lab by the lead researcher. It's the so-and-so lab. And often we've got a group of, we've got a body of work already happening. We need someone to come in and just work with us on what we're already doing, but using this bit of machinery, not this bit of machinery. And that's the whole PhD. Now, I'm not saying that's easy because it's not, but you can just see, you just slot in, it's one particular thing. It already exists as a research lab. Very different in creative PhDs. You come in often with your own passion area. You've got to find a supervisor who's interested in it and gets it. And then the supervisor can wrangle all of it. There's no lab full of, 15 other PhD students and 8 supervisors who are all working on the same problem, but yours is the comedy version, yours is the horror version, yours is the rom-com version. That doesn't exist. Maybe it should, but that doesn't. So you can see it's supervising can be quite labor intensive. And again, that's just an image from a kind of a reflective digital paper that candidate is making around. This is actually someone who, one of my students actually, he's doing experimental screenwriting, digital filmmaking, but he struggles to write academically, which is, quite common in our areas. So he's creating digital kind of reflexive video papers as like to substitute some of the writing. So again, his will be a hybrid of, films, scripts, films about the process, and also some academic writing as well, methodology, introduction, etc. So again, supervisory teams with complementary skills, peer-to-peer groups that enable to if you've got enough people around in your university, or even if it's not in your university, it could be, for example, through the network, screenwriting network, having a peer-to-peer group where you just kind of support each other and really, give each other feedback on the work, but really help each other think about what it means to be a creative researcher or a practitioner researcher, which is often a big transition from being just a practitioner. I think that's a really useful thing to do because, again, we don't know everything. Supervisors don't know everything. It's that support. I mean, I'm sure many of you here who've done it or who are doing it. It's the same with me when I did mine. It was part-time and it was distance-based. It didn't really have a community, and it can be quite lonely. It can be quite hard, and sometimes you haven't got anyone to ask a question about. But I think if you can bring together people, that collective think, is really, really important. And it also builds like the kind of community of people who might go to conferences together and publish together and edit journals and all those things. The image there, just FYI, this was a play script. This is a really interesting PhD that he finished a couple of years ago. This was someone who got a background in kind of HR, human resources, leadership, and after 30 odd years, he was just sick, tired, and depressed about how bad leadership can be and how toxic it can be. So he started looking at the ethics of leadership, and he started looking at creative approaches to understand good leadership. And he basically did leadership studies, business studies, ethics, and script writing. It was a play, not a screenplay. And he wrote a play about organizations and about workplaces that again embodied this kind of, it was like a provocation for how leadership could be versus how often, not always, but how often leadership can be. So he was contributing not only to kind of creative research with a particular subject matter, but also contributing to leadership studies and ethics of leadership. Oh yeah, this is just, oh yeah, this last but certainly not least, you'll find if you're not doing it already, I'm sure many of you are, but examining PhDs, you just really get to learn more about how it works. Researching, being on top of things, going to conferences, hearing people talk about research and publishing in the area, I think is really, really useful. I mean, I would say that because that's what I do, but I think you can really, if you're really interested in supervision, want to be a good supervisor, really invest in it, invest your time into it, and just don't just do it as, oh, I better turn up to this meeting, give some feedback. Really, students need really good supervisors. And it can be one of those things where, years down the track, people, it's like transformative experience for them. And they become really good supervisors as well. Everybody's a winner, basically. I'm just going to very quickly show a couple more slides, and I'm aware of the time, so about an hour, I think. Oh, sorry, half an hour left, Banana. I want to obviously have time
Absolutely
for questions.
fine.
But
yes.
I'll just skip through some of this. It's not the whole thing. This is just some more specific stuff to screenwriting. Where's everybody gone? There you are. Just checking people can see. I think you probably can. You can't chat.
Yes, we're fine.
Okay, good. Now, I think Alex in the room, well, he was earlier, and he might recognize this because Alec McCauley and I published an article on this, which is where this comes from a few years ago. What actually is screenwriting research? And again, I just thought it'd be useful just to offer what I think is this, a definition, not the be all and end all, but obviously a good definition. A practice in which the screenwriter makes use of the intellectual space offered by the academy, university, sometimes with industry, because sometimes you might do industry partner PhDs or industry field work, to incubate and experiment with ideas that are research informed with the intention that the screenplay and or the screenwriting process, as per the previous thing, changes as a result. There has to be a transformation. There has to be a change of some sort. It has to be some new contribution to knowledge. And you might sound really obvious. Oh yeah, of course, that's what a PhD is. But, that really embracing this idea of not just coming into a research setting or intellectual space, assuming your university is intellectual, because not always, and really making use of it, not just doing it, but actually embracing it and learning and really reading and things you've never read before, and just you'd be surprised how that can really inform your practice. It can really make you think about creative work, creative strategies, creative choices differently. You would have no idea before that was even possible. So really, really take the opportunity to really embrace it and then track how your work and your thinking as a practitioner has shifted. A recent student who finished, he did something around story development, story producing, working in his writer's room methodology, did field work with several writers' rooms. And He's got, 25 years of working in industry. He's just done it. But by gosh, he was like, I never would have thought that I could even rethink what it meant to do that work and do it differently. And it was a particular context around a particular demographic. And he's now going, well, gosh, it's totally transformed the way that I can work as a story editor, story producer in these writers' rooms, informed by theory, informed by reflective practice. So, it can actually have real, even for industry practitioners and people who might go back into industry, it can actually have a lot of impact. And just very briefly, again, this may be obvious, but people can come to screenwriting research. And in fact, in the room now, we've probably got people who would identify differently here from quite different domains, quite different disciplinary domains. Some people think about screenwriting as part of creative writing. Some people think about it as part of screen and media production. Some people see it as a kind of a branch of or as a creative output of film and TV studies. Some people look at it in performance, history, sociology, cultural studies, English literature. And again, depending on your own background, but also if you've got candidates, students joining you, it's worth finding out, where do they come from and what do they see as screenplay? Because we all see it quite differently. Our training has been very different, and that brings a different flavor to the work you do. I've examined a lot of PhDs across, I've examined a lot, but I've examined screenwriting PhDs that come from history departments. I've examined screenwriting PhDs that come from performance. I've not examined screenwriting PhD, but certainly read research about, as I mentioned before, sociology and people using screenwriting in sociology. Scripts are not necessarily of the standard you would expect in creative writing, but they're actually doing a different thing. So again, just working out where your people have come from and what lenses you put onto this. And also, speaking of lenses, critical lenses, conceptual frameworks. Not every, obviously, every screenwriting PhD is not the same. It has a different take on something. Some people, as I said before, really focus on creative practice and process. That's their contribution. That's their research question. It's about doing, making. It's about, it could be industry practice. Some people come from what you might say industry studies. So they might be looking at genre, they might be looking at policy, they might be looking at, again, process. Some people do come in from critical theory. They're actually very well versed in critical theory, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, memory, whatever it is. And they use screenwriting practice, even if they're a practitioner themselves, not just the theories coming in. They bring together, say, creative practice screenwriting with something that they're really, really well read about, environmental studies, for example. Others, no, they just want to do something that is more industry focused, and that's fine as well. But again, it's just the idea of they're not the same, these areas, that they've got different thesis questions, they've got different approaches, they've got different literature review types, they've got different ways you might structure and play around with the thesis. So again, really having that meta view of where they're coming from, what they're doing. You might, find someone who comes in and says, I want to do a Bordersian reading of screenwriting practice, or I want to do a, I don't know, Derridian, whatever, Heidegger, and that's what that's their focus, and they put that lens through everything. Others don't do that. They go, I've got no theoretical framework. I'm just looking at screenwriting, script development practice process, and they might use various kind of literature, areas of literature to kind of frame it, but there's no actual specific critical through line, and that's fine as well. It's different every time. Just got to check out which page number I was looking at, not all of them. And again, just it is a discrete area of practice-based, asterisks, because of the thing that I mentioned earlier, the different terminologies. Research, I think it's interesting how it is kind of situated between creative writing and screen production. You find screenwriting has been written about in creative writing studies and also in screen production. film and media studies. Also, obviously, literature, English literature or literature as well. And obviously screenwriting studies, which has built itself to be a field. Obviously, it's part of that as well. But it kind of sits in between different areas. And I think that's really, really useful. And just, again, most people are aware of this, but thinking about the research objects or the creative artifacts that are produced as knowledge artifacts for examination is obviously a much, the last probably, I don't know, 8-9 years has been quite a lot of work published, creative screenplays published as research outputs. So you can actually now obviously access research screenplays. So people have purposely published, produced whatever screenplays that are driven by research. And in some cases, in journals, you can actually read the research statements that surround them. So it's really useful for candidates to look at them and think about how is this person talking about their script as research. So there's, 15 years ago, there was none of this out there. There was nothing about screenwriting practice research 15 years ago, like quite seriously, zero. And now there's journal articles, there's books, there's special issues of journals, there's creative practice journals that have screenplays in them. So it's, obviously that's good. So, when I get another thesis that says, nobody has written about screenwriting practice research, I go, hang on a minute. And I think, how does the supervisor not know that? So again, being aware of the literature. Just going to flick through really quickly. I'm going to skip some just because of time. Oh yeah, here we go. Just on this idea of contribution, there is literature on what contribution to knowledge looks like. This, from the late 90s, came out of UK, it's kind of looking at, I think it was design. And people started to conceptualize what does a contribution to knowledge look like in design in this case. And you have some examples there of what it could be. Again, like I said about research-enabled practice-enabled knowledge, different research questions, different research design, different contributions to knowledge. It's never the same. It could be about, the aesthetic development of a work, could be about, the empirical work is novel, but the processes are the same, etc., etc. It's not the same across any. And this one, Jerry Wellington, who's written about doctorateness he's an education specialist, talks about, again, similar, there's different ways of looking at what new knowledge is in doctorates broadly. And then Alison Holbrook and I, we wrote an article a few years ago where we tried to map this again as creative writing broadly, not screenwriting specifically. That's an open access article, actually. Contributing to knowledge in creative writing, what, where, how, I think it was called. And again, just showing you how different it can be and how people can conceptualize contribution differently. So again, as a supervisor, you've got to think, well, what is the state of the field? What is out there? Can we look at examples of PhDs? Where is it going? And so we can be sure that what we're submitting and being examined is actually a contribution to knowledge. I'll just very quickly, sorry about all this. Some of this will be going through in the Czech Republic if anybody's going. But I just thought this would be useful. So with Alison Holbrook, we've been doing a bit of work on examining completed PhD theses, looking at PhDs that have passed, and looking at how they talk about the screenplay as a contribution to knowledge. I'm hoping they'll get that article published soon. It's almost ready to go. And we've examined a number of theses and done some text analysis on how people talk about contribution to knowledge with the creative work. And there's various outcomes of that. The biggest one is that a lot of theses don't even articulate the creative work as research. It's actually quite absent. It's assumed because it's in the thesis. Here we are. Now read the creative work. There you go. Whereas there are some that go, spend a lot of time, a lot of detail explaining how it's contributing to knowledge. So what we've just I guess distilled from this is some questions that I think are really important in terms of speaking to the field, which is people here, people who are currently supervising, will be supervising in the future. They're kind of tough questions, but I'm just putting them out there anyway. Are examiners assessing effort over contribution? I.e., the candidate's done a lot of work. Wow, look, there's 80,000 words here. Brilliant, great. Sometimes you might find that the contribution might be, you think, oh, that's new knowledge? Okay, I'm not really sure about that. But because there's a lot of work there, it's like, oh, well, they've obviously done a PhD because look, it's so big and, And I should have said as well that Alison Holbrook, I'll be working with, she's done a lot of research in doctoral areas, and she's examined thousands of examiner reports across all disciplines, and so has a lot of knowledge about how examiners talk about contribution and how examiners examine, essentially. What do examiners accept as doctoral level work, and is this good enough? When is a creative artifact a doctoral level creative artifact? I've already hinted at that kind of stuff. It's quite tough in a way to think about that, but how do you know that the script is working at the doctoral level? What is it you're looking for? Is it clear from the thesis that you need to be looking for a certain thing? Is it explained where the contribution is? If it's not explained, how do you know it's there? Are you assuming? Again, signposting is really important. Do examiners examine a assess a PhD holistically, or are they commenting on the two things separately? You might sometimes find reports that talk a lot about the creative work, blah, 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 but then they talk about the critical work, but they don't really pull it together as a thesis. You don't often see the connections between the research questions, the underpinning research, and then the creative work and how it connects. So I think there's still quite a bit of work to be done there in this discipline, I have to say. And again, when we talk about the PhD thesis, the thesis is the combination of all the parts. Thesis is an argument, and an argument, part of the evidence required to make an argument is the creative work. So what argument is it making, and how does it fit with the rest of the thesis? What is the doctoral task of a creative practice PhD? What is the point of it? What is the ultimate aim? Yes, to produce, to write a screenplay. Yes, to create. But what's the actual ultimate aim, and why is the person doing it? Where have they come from? What is their intention? How is doing a PhD enabling that thing to happen? Is that clear? And again, as I mentioned before, is the creative work in a PhD how it would appear outside of a PhD? Or is it different? Is there something inherent in it that is different, that is novel? Or is it being used as a method to create knowledge or new insights about process? And is that the actual contribution? And is this the process, the scripting standard? And that might be fine, as long as you know that that's what it's doing, rather than looking for some novelty in this when it might not be there. But if you haven't told the examiner that's what it is, they might be looking for it and then going, hang on, what's going on here? So I'll just let you know, this is just so you know, this is a bit of a teaser for what might be coming up in the Czech Republic. These are some of the questions we asked when we did this study. And again, to go back to my opening comments, this was not just about, oh, let's look at doctoral theses, creative theses and screenwriting and work out, how do they articulate the script as research. The underlying, I guess, idea was thinking, has the candidate, as evidence in the thesis, which is not always the be all and end all, but has the candidate learned how to articulate at the doctoral level how a creative work is contributing to knowledge, which is why that goes back to this idea of supervision, not just in terms of supervisors signing off a thesis and saying, have you done enough? But actually, if the candidate can't articulate in writing, or if it's a oral defense of viva verbally, how the creative work is part of a research endeavor and what it contributes, then does that mean that the candidate hasn't gone through a learning process that enables them to think metacognitively or meta-epistemically, so that they can actually sit above the whole PhD and see what it's doing and talk about all the parts and tell you how it's all working. And if you move one bit here or shift something here, this is how you put it back together to make sense. And that's what kind of doctoral level thinking is. So there's a whole learning theory that kind of underpins this work, which goes back to the idea of the role of supervisors in being able to get their candidate there. Have they got there yet? You might see that written down somewhere. Have they got there yet? Have they got there? What does got there mean? Are they at the doctoral level? What does that mean? And often it's basically, are they able to think about thinking? And they talk about thinking, not I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, but can they talk about what it means to think and pull things together and synthesize and contribute? So I hope that kind of makes sense. Maybe it's a bit mind-blowing, or maybe not, maybe it's obvious. And again, I'll just finish on this quotation from Jenny Wilson, who did a fabulous study of Australian film schools, drama schools, performing arts, etc., art schools, where they became part of universities and staff had to do PhDs in order to keep their jobs, pretty much. And she studied that kind of government policy shift around art schools, film schools, drama schools going to universities, and how it shaped people working in them and their understanding of research. And this is an example from one of the interviews she did, where a person did a PhD, finished, got the title, etc., and said, when asked the question, how did the doctorate kind of transform your practice, or how has it changed you? Basically, they said, well, my practice is exactly the same as it was before I did the PhD, but I'm much better now documenting the process. And I would just end by saying, that's a real missed opportunity for actually embracing research to actually advance the practice, so that the practice becomes, it embodies and genders knowledge, and it contributes to thinking, it contributes to society, culture, whatever it is, and it's actually in the work itself.